We have a good panelist of teachers along with a guest speaker with us tonight. So I just want to introduce who's with us here. We have our school site council, and on that site council are myself. I'm the associate principal of curriculum instruction, Mary Lindsay, ELA teacher, Shelby Schofield, ELA teacher, Lauren Savage, science teacher, and Heather Sharp, who's an ELA teacher. So we're going to hear more from them in just a minute. We're going to give them a chance to talk about restorative practices in their classroom. But I just want to quickly introduce the topic for tonight and give an overview of what we're talking about. Our objective tonight is for participants to gain an understanding of what restorative practices are, why and how we're using that to transition to restorative practices here, and who to go for support with behavior issues at the high school. So we're going to do quick introductions. Then we're going to turn it over to Kamal Panu. He's our vice principal over disciplinary matters. He's going to give us an overview of restorative practices and talk about some of the specifics of how we're applying that at the high school. And then we'll have a chance for Q&A. So that'll be a chance to ask any questions about restorative practices or any questions in general about the school. So you see you have a chat feature over on the right-hand side if you're watching us through YouTube Live, and that's where you can type in the questions as we continue some of our meetings in the virtual environment. So moving forward, I want to hear from each of our teachers, and I asked them just to share their perspective on restorative practices real quick. It's something that we're excited about, and I asked them to share something that they're excited about as we continue to focus on restorative practices, or one way that they've seen an impact in their classroom through the use of restorative practices so far. So I'll throw it to Mary Lindsay first to share some of that.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've been encouraged about in starting restorative practices in my classroom is that in the asking questions to the student when I see a misbehavior, I actually get to the root of the issue. I'm not just like sort of sticking a Band-Aid over a behavior problem. So for example, today I had a student, we do 10 minutes of silent independent reading in my class. And I had a student who just kept talking, was on their phone, just really distracting both themselves and other students. And I could have just given that student a consequence and moved on, but that wouldn't have really solved the issue. By having a conversation with the student, I found out that they had finished a book that they really enjoyed and just didn't know how to start a new book. They didn't have anything to read. So it was actually that the behavior was masking sort of what's a content issue is how do you find a good book to read? It turned out the book that he had finished was part of a series. So he's going to start that next book tomorrow in class. And now we know that part of his struggle is not just being distractible. It's about finding a great book that he's going to love. And by having that conversation, we really built up a relationship. So he's going to be more willing to actually get on task and be less distracting next time.
Thank you, Mary. So that's a great example of how asking questions can uncover some of the underlying issues that we may not have come to the surface if we applied different disciplinary tactics. So thank you for sharing that. Next up is Shelby Schofield.
All right. I think one of the things I like the most about restorative justice is it changes the overall tone of the classroom. So if a student was misbehaving, normally they would get scolded and I send them downstairs and I'd be done with the situation. But with restorative justice, you kind of become a collaborator with the student in a sense, where you get the opportunity to sit down and talk with them to find out a solution to the problem. And in my experience so far, I've been pleasantly surprised. The other day I had a conversation with a student and asked him to come up with a solution to the problem. And I would also think of a solution. And I was pleasantly surprised. He actually came up with a really good idea that I hadn't even thought of. So that transition from just addressing the problem really quickly to collaborating with the student in finding a solution. That has made a big difference in my classroom.
Thank you, Shelby. I think you're hitting on a great aspect there, which is the collaborative piece as we work together. Next, I'm going to hand it over to Heather Sharp.
So I have a student that I've had an ongoing disposition kind of concern with, who is very talkative and really likes to talk about his text that he's reading, even when it's not a partner activity. And so we've had an opportunity to talk, and he was kind of taken aback about when I asked him what he thought he could do to improve the situation and what he thought he was in charge of in terms of redirecting his experience in the classroom. He was kind of taken aback that I was asking him and giving him the opportunity to form an opinion, rather than, are we going to call home, or are we going to have a consequence where I go to the office? So I think that's good for students, because the student has an opportunity to see that they're involved in their overall experience and that they can empower themselves in that conversation.
Right. So I appreciate that. That's another great example of collaboration. I think sometimes the initial thought when it comes to restorative practices is that students are getting off too easy by not getting a traditional consequence, but by actually involving them in the process, they're putting more work into it themselves. So that's a great example of that. Then it looks like, Lauren, you've been able to reconnect with us. So I'll have you share an example from your classroom as well.
I don't have an example yet, as I'm still new to learning how restorative practices are going to work in my classroom. But I'm really excited, looking forward to how using restorative practices in our classroom will encourage that bond between our students and ourselves. As Mary said, really understanding the root cause of what is happening with the student and how that would improve our relationships between parents and students and teachers and other faculty, as we start understanding why this kid is acting out, why this kid is having these issues. And we actually are having more of these conversations that, by giving just a simple consequence, we often avoid and take a shortcut to just give them a consequence and never really get to the student's personal issues and what they're struggling with.
Great. I appreciate that, Lauren. It's another example of trying to uncover the root issue for the problem so that we can come up with an actual solution for it. And not just move on without having restored that. So I want to thank each of the teachers from sharing that perspective from the classroom. I think it's really valuable to hear what's going on directly in the classroom, and our teachers to stay with us and be able to offer insight as we move forward. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Kamal Panu. He's our vice principal over discipline, and he is working in conjunction with our restorative practices team to develop our restorative practices plan as we continue moving forward. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Kamal.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you, staff members, for sharing. I think the first question is, why the shift to restorative practices? Ultimately, whenever there's a situation and there's a need for discipline, it's an opportunity for learning and growth. And moving away from the traditional approach of discipline, in which a consequence is assigned, a restorative approach asks a student to be a participant in coming up with a plan to repair any harm done in the community. And in using that approach, not only is it an opportunity for growth for the student, but it's also an opportunity to create a further and strengthen the bond of relationship here at Mountain House High School. Next slide, please. One of the big things about restorative practices is notion that when the harm is done in the community, that the student has an opportunity to repair that. Now, sometimes that may be with one individual specifically, just as the teacher shared. Ms. Lindsay was saying, there was a student who was impacting her learning environment. So that in repairing that harm, they came up with a plan in which the student is also going to have a book. Now, sometimes the repair and the harm might be more than one student. It might be several students. It might be several staff members. In fact, we've had several situations where a student's harm has caused damage to the entire school. So we think about ways that that student can repair, not only for those individuals impacted, but also to repair in the community as well. Next slide. The core beliefs of restorative practices is that we're all human beings, we are all worthy, and we are all interconnected. Mountain House itself is an amazing melting pot. Even just looking at the participants in this group, and for those of you at home, is we all have our unique beliefs and backgrounds, and in using that, we can also form a common culture amongst all the individuals at Mountain House High School, which is that we are all worthy of one another's love, attention, respect. And as a community, we can help strengthen one another as well. Next slide. So the core beliefs that are supported is respect, dignity, and mutual concern. You know, one of the amazing things about restorative practices, as the staff has shared too, it's an opportunity to build. And it isn't specific to, you know, one type of student or, students that sometimes, are struggling academically. This is for all of our students, whether they're at the top of their class academically, or if it's one of our athletes, or it's one of our artists, or, students that are in our culinary program. Across the board is we practice these three beliefs of respect, dignity, and also this notion that we are concerned for one another. Next slide. So in creating or using systems of restorative practices, a big thing is nurturing healthy relationships. So mom and pop, those of you that are watching at home, you yourself can also be part of a restorative community at home. I guarantee if something happens, you're having a conversation with your students saying, well, what happened? Or why did you do that? And that's this idea of having this healthy relationship where we talk to one another. What doesn't work in the traditional ways of discipline is that you just tell somebody you're in trouble and then you never have a conversation about it. This also gives that student the opportunity to repair that harm. So if something happens, whether it's at the school site or if it's at home, they have an opportunity to say, you know what, I need to do this to fix it. As somebody who's sometimes on the other side of these conversations and is working with a student, it's amazing to see some of the things they come up with and their plans. Most of our kids, you ask them, well, what do you got to do to fix it? They'll tell you, they'll be very honest. Hey, I think I should do this, this, and this. Or they say, you know what, I violated your trust. I need to come up with a plan where I can repair that. And it's in having these conversations and these healthy relationships that you're able to have a restorative community. And it also creates an equitable learning environment. Again, this isn't something that's specific for a group of students or for a certain demographic. The idea is that for everybody on campus is that we treat each other with love and respect, and we all can work together to make the community stronger and repair any harm that's done. Next slide. So again, it's based on this notion of respect, dignity, and mutual concern. And at the center of this, and looking at this visual too, is a child. I always tell staff members, and we've spoken about this too, the way we view if a student has progressed is not how they act at the end of month 1 or month 3, but it's thinking about who walked into our doors at Mountain House High School and the individual that's leaving, and them being able to show that respect and also to give each other that dignity and that mutual concern and become productive members of our community. So I see a little kid in the middle of this with a Mustang logo is the way I see this visual. Next slide. So again, why do we practice restorative practices? I mean, to be frank, because it works. Communities in which people speak to one another and talk about harm that's done and are very vocal in terms of what we need to do to repair thrive. Those are the communities that we want everybody to be a part of. There shouldn't be a power dynamic where one side says they can do no wrong. We have to educate these young men and women and also let them know that we need to listen to them too. Just as the teacher shared, is they will tell us if they are dealing with something that we did not know about that is causing them to behave or react in a certain way. And it's in listening with one another and then coming up with that plan of repair that we can fix anything that does happen. Next slide, please. Also, it's to encourage responsibility and accountability. I mean, as kids get older in life, if they do something that does damage, if they damage a relationship with somebody, they have to take that ownership. Having them sit in the room and the old school way of you're going to go write lines on the board, there's no ownership in that. We have to have that conversation and then model to them what it looks like in repairing. And again, it allows for all members to be part of this community and to fix any mistakes that happen. Next slide, please. And lastly, it's just, it helps in pushing students academically. No student will learn if they don't feel safe in a classroom. That's a fact. And if a student knows that they're respected and they are valued as a member of that community and treated as equal, then their academics are also going to fly. They're going to, they will do much better academically than if they didn't have that notion of community. Next slide.
Actually, can I jump in right there real quick?
Absolutely.
One of the other things that I really have liked about restorative practices is it's also not just helping their learning in terms of the academics, but our students are growing and learning about themselves and how to control themselves and be an adult. And a lot of what they are learning through those restorative conversations is how to approach a problem differently. So just the same way that as a student struggles with a concept in class, and I don't punish them for not getting it the first time, some of the times when a student is misbehaving, it's truly because they haven't learned any other options for dealing with a difficult emotion or for feeling like they're struggling or challenged with something. And it's, in my experience, been a really great time to teach students, here's another way that you can handle that situation. And so it's like you said, Mr. P, it's not just going through lines, right? That's not teaching them how to respond to that situation differently. It's really helping them see there are other options that they can be using.
Absolutely. And, one of the other things about being in a restorative community, and parents, if you're wondering, like, you guys keep saying restorative, but what does that actually look and sound like? We're going to get to that part in just a bit. But it's this idea of each other accountable, and it's when you come into a classroom, and it doesn't matter whether it's Miss Lindsay's classroom, Miss Sharp's, Miss Schofield's, Miss Savage's, or whoever's it may be, it's that we are all members of this community. We are all part of the Mountain House community, and together we can strengthen this community. Now, Mr. Shum had mentioned my work a little bit with the Restorative Practices team. Every staff member, and especially the ones that are here, but every staff member at Mountain House High School is part of our Restorative Practices team. This is something that all staff members are getting training on, and in addition to practicing, but also utilizing within their classrooms. One of those staff members that I do want to introduce right now is Jabari Carr, also known as Coach Carr in the community. He's our head varsity football coach. But Jabari's come on board as well to help and assist in having these conversations and come up with plans of repair. So Jabari, if you want to do a little bit of an intro, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Panu. Jabari Carr, for those who don't know, I'm a varsity football coach, but I'm so much more than that. I also am the restorative practice specialist, and it's right up my alley. Graduated with a degree in behavioral science, and I think exactly what Mr. Panu said in the sense of, I think it works hand in hand with me being a coach, right? We work as a team, the entire level of the high school. And, one reason that I'm there is to have an extra layer and to be an extra layer of support and intervention. Because, your littles, when I say littles, I mean high school kids, do have days where, they kind of need to be redirected and things of that nature. So instead of them being sent to the principal's office and things of that nature, they're going to be, sent my way. And this isn't, a referral basis and things of that nature. It's to act as a team. Essentially, what one thing we want them to do is to work in a healthy environment. And, obviously I've taken on the role as a restorative practice specialist. So it's something I believe in and something that's dear to my heart. And, having the rest of the community involved is huge for us. We just want to make sure that everybody is on board, because with the community on board, then we could actually make this thing work. And like Mr. Panu said, we've seen that the old way doesn't work, and this work actually does work. And, we've been doing it, as a restorative practice specialist for about 3 weeks now, and we've seen it work hand over fist in just the 3 weeks where I've been on campus actually doing it. That's my spiel. I'm long-winded. I'm a coach. I apologize. We're definitely excited to get this going, and I'm excited to be a part of this team.
All right, next slide. Thank you, sir. Also, members of the team there's my face. I looked a lot younger back then, and then there's also Miss Perez, who unfortunately couldn't join us tonight, but she's also a member of the team. And again, every single staff member, their face should be on this slide, because essentially we are a community, and as the adults in the community, we model for our students on what a restorative approach looks like. So everybody is part of the restorative practices team. But there's my face again. Next slide. One of the cool things and something that we're actually very excited about is we're going to be opening up a wellness center on campus. This is something that we've been working towards for a while now, especially the need as we continue with the pandemic. But a place where students can come and have these conversations and to plan on actions of repair. It's also a place where students, if they just wanted to get a moment away and just sit quietly and be able to reflect or just have an opportunity to gather their thoughts. So we will be opening up our wellness center. It's in the main office. We're going to have a massive kickoff celebration. Our counseling team, in addition, will be sending some additional communication out over the next few weeks. But absolutely, parents and community members, look out for these announcements. And we look forward to seeing y'all in our wellness center. Next slide, excuse me. All right. So as I had mentioned a little bit earlier, we're talking about restorative practices, but many of you are probably wondering, well, what does a restorative approach look like? The main component of it is that you work with students in coming up with plans of repair and to help build community. And there's a way of going about it and getting them to participate and ask questions, and also a way for you to express how you're feeling. That is the central part of a restorative conversation or coming up with that plan. So we're going to go over a little bit over those affective statements and questions. And parents, you can do this right now. In fact, some of you all are already pros at this. So this is going to be a quick review. We'll go to the next slide. So our staff members, when they're in class and if a student is given a directive, a student, if they're not following the directions, the staff member is encouraged to share how it's impacting them. For example, if somebody just says, get to work, a student might say, like, oh, okay. But if a teacher is able to say, I'm actually disappointed that you're not getting started on your work because I know that you're able to meet the expectations of the lesson, or I know that this is a topic that you're very excited about. It makes it personable. It lets the student know that this isn't a directive that is just thrown out there. It's also very specific. This works for the positive and also the negative. For example, if a student's being shouted out, in school, you hear this all the time. Oh my goodness, you're so smart. But if you want a behavior to repeat itself, it has to be specific. The student needs to know what they're doing for them to repeat the same behavior. Being smart is thrown around so many times that a kid might be confused on what that actually means. So that it's giving very specific feedback to that child about what the expectation is and the impact that it's having. So here's a couple of those examples. Mr. Shum, if you want to go to the next slide. And then also, if something happens in the classroom, it's a way of going about and questioning that student because you want them to answer and to come up with a plan. It doesn't make sense that us as the educators and the adults just say, well, why'd you do that? And then we answer the question for them. We have to have the student share. They're a member of the community. They also have to come up with the plan on how to repair. It doesn't make sense for us to say, well, why'd you do that? And say, well, I'm going to make you do a detention or X, Y, and Z. They have to be able to share. And what that involves is a specific way of questioning. So if you want to go to the next slide. So these questions allow for students to reflect, just like I mentioned, and click. And you can use them in any time in addressing students' behavior. Again, parents, some of y'all are pros already at this, and you'll see some of the examples. So it's like, say for example, something broke. You come home and there's a broken vase in the living room. You're not going to be like, go to your room. No, you're going to investigate. You're going to be figuring out what specifically happened and then coming up with a plan. So these are affective questions. So you can ask the student, what happened? What were you thinking at the time? What have you thought about since? Who's been impacted? What do you think you need to do to make it right? And it allows that student to say, hey, I know I'm going to have to own up and fix this, but also allows them to think about what they need to do to repair. And in traditional, or I say old school discipline, this was missing. Nobody ever asked them a question. A consequence was assigned, and that student didn't actually have an opportunity to think about who was impacted by their decision. Next slide. It also, for those individuals that are impacted, now, in this case, you come home and there's a vase broken in your living room. You may have other students that live there. You might have maybe grandma and grandpa there as well, too. It allows a student to think about who else was impacted by your decision. And, sometimes kids don't take that into account, or they haven't thought of, wow, this is a danger for my younger brother or sister, or wow, this can actually be really dangerous because we have pets in the house. But there's this notion of asking them, well, who else has also been impacted by this decision? In classrooms, we see it all the time. If a student is consistently calling out, the other student's learning opportunities being impacted. And in using these questions and then waiting for a response, it makes the student take a moment, pause, and really reflect on what they were specifically doing. In old school traditional discipline, as I like to say, or as a lot of us went through it, is the student also sees them as the victim, where sometimes the punishment is so punitive that instead of the student actually thinking about what they did and trying to repair it, they get frustrated and at the entire process. Here's a perfect example. If a student does something on campus and they ended up being suspended in a traditional approach, the student's anger is, oh man, I got suspended. The notion of them thinking about what they did or that action is superseded by their anger of what the consequence is. And what we're trying to do is get away from that. We want students to think about what they specifically did and the impact that it has had on the community. It doesn't help them face the consequence of their decision if a punitive punishment is given out automatically. Next slide. We try to pair our consequences in a restorative manner that are logical. For example, you're not going to be suspended if you threw food in the cafeteria. A logical consequence of that is go pick up the food. So, for example, just this week, we had a student who was trying to practice his basketball shooting, I would say. Took an apple, tried to shoot it, completely missed it. Now, an old school approach would have been like, that's a detention after school. It doesn't solve the problem of you made a mess in the cafeteria. You've impacted the custodians now who have to go pick that up. So a logical consequence that we paired with that student is they worked with the cafeteria staff to clean the cafeteria. That's something they came up with. When we asked the student, well, what are you going to do to fix this? Well, Mr. Panu, I think I should clean the cafeteria. I think that's a great idea. We're working with that student to repair that harm, as opposed to just sending them off and then they start sensing or start seeing themselves as the victim. Teachers, is there an example that y'all would like to share from one of your classes, or I'll open it up?
I don't have a specific example of what's happened in my classroom, but I have noticed that there's a student who is coming around and cleaning the desk in my classroom each afternoon. So I'm assuming that's a result of the restorative practices with that student.
Yeah, that was we don't go into specifics because every kid is case by case, and that's also private. But a student of that nature is doing some repair work in the community because they may have done some damage in the community, and I'll leave it as that part. But I'm glad that you got to see him, Miss Savage. Yeah. Next slide, please. Ultimately, the characteristics of a restorative conversation is to understand what happened. It's to listen to one another and to give them a space. So teachers and students have a space and an opportunity to think, reflect, plan, and repair. And it goes on this notion of mutual respect. It also is this love between one another that we see each other as human beings. It's to focus on the impact of the actions. And also, just like the teachers had mentioned earlier, it's to identify any unmet needs. If a student hasn't eaten since the day before, and maybe, money is tied at the house, that makes sense on why they're lethargic in the morning, or they may be angry. In having that conversation and asking, well, why did you do that? That may come out. That is also a part of community building and restoration work. But it's for us to sit and work with our student body addressing these unmet needs. I think parents, our biggest thing for you, and as we've continued to move towards this process, is we need your partnership. We thank you for being here as well, but also to understand that this takes time. A restorative approach isn't something that's done within 5 seconds. There's certain students that we have on campus where they check in with an adult every day. And again, it's that end line that we're looking at. For some students, they may not be comfortable sharing, but 3 months down the road, this student is able to reflect and say, you know what, I did do something that's wrong. And it takes time. On the staff side of us, what we ask is when we call home or reach out to you parents, we're reaching out to you to let you know that not only are we looping you in, is because we've tried to come up with a plan to help your student. Our plan's not working. We're also asking, can you also assist us in this plan? And that's what we want when we do reach out to parents. Our job is to educate your kids, and we treat your kids as if they're our own. And our big thing is that we want to make sure that we give your students that opportunity to think, and also at the same time to reflect on their decisions. Thank you, Mr. Shum. Next slide, please. And this is just, I think of it as a giant quilt. There's many things that we do on campus, whether it's our different clubs or our academics or our sports teams, or, whether it's ongoing events that are on campus. It's this notion of us continuing to build relationships. And as I said before, every single staff member that I have on campus is a part of the Restorative Practices team. And it's interwoven into our days. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of conversations. When we see students in the courtyard or in the hallway, we say good morning to them. And it's this notion that we want them to feel welcome. No child will ever learn or do well academically if they don't feel as if they're part of a classroom or a community. And this is something that we've just woven into our days alongside everything else that we do offer here at Mountain House High School. Next slide. And that's my part.
Yeah, so I do want to open it up to questions, and I see that we have quite a few viewers online. You can type in your questions using the chat feature on YouTube Live. It's over on the right-hand side of the screen where you can type in questions. Kamala, I got a question to start us off. So you talked about the Wellness Center coming in January 2022. Jabari, you introduced yourself. We're so happy to have you on board, and you talked about being with us for 3 weeks. Even though you've been involved with us in the wider, bigger picture for longer than that, but involved as a restorative specialist for the past 3 weeks. I could see how hearing that, somebody who's hearing about this for the first time can be mistaken in thinking that this is a new thing, or it's a trend that, we're focusing now on and could go away. Kemal, would you mind talking just about the history of it a little bit, the development, and what the plan is going forward? So the potential to involve parents as well.
Absolutely. So this notion of a wellness is something that's already, our counseling department it's already embedded under them. If you go to our website, you can look at the different resources that we do have. What we wanted to change is we wanted to have a specific centralized location on campus that would serve as a center not only for the student body, but also for the community as well. Part of a wellness center is that it opens up our community to the different resources and additional supports that are out there. We've already had elements of it and parts of wellness that's being incorporated in terms of what are different resources in the community right now that can help our families. But this notion of having one centralized location and then building upon that, so it not only is a center for the students, but absolutely for our Mountain House families.
Thank you, Kemal. And as we go forward, I believe there's going to be some possibility of parents getting involved.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mind talking about that just a little bit?
Yeah, one of the things about wellness and just attending to the student, it's not only on the academic side, but it's also on that social and emotional learning. One of the things that we've talked about is incorporating mindfulness, and how that would look like on our high school campus, or ways students can deal with stress and anxiety. Our counselors just did a session on how to cope with anxiety, and also in work coming up with plans on ways for students to self identify when they are feeling anxious or nervous, and what are some of the tools to use to combat that. So the parents absolutely, as I mentioned before, is when we start sending out blurbs, I know it's going to be a little bit tricky with COVID. And some of those protocols, I would love to open up all the, the campus, but, absolutely, we want to make sure that we're able to have our community there as well.
So I see we do have a question from a viewer here. Can you please share any resources on the same topic with the parents?
Yeah, so if you actually go to our website and go to under the counseling page, they have some resources already. Parents feel free to take a look at that. Also, our district website also has a couple of resources as well. One of the other things that we're plugging right now is it's called the Parent Project, and these are training sessions for parents, and it talks about how to work alongside your youth, and also is an opportunity for parents to learn about what some of the things that they're doing in terms of management and also routine building that can also aid their student as well. So you can take a look at our website, our counseling department. You can reach out to your student's counselor as well. They can also share that information.
Thank you. And we'll stay on. I see just that one question so far, but if you have any other questions, please feel free to type those in. And Campbell, you had mentioned that the counselors as a resource, if there's additional questions on restorative practices, how those are being implemented at the high school, resources, anything like that. Are the counselors the best resource for that? Where should parents reach out?
You can always reach out to myself. You can also reach out to Jabari as well. And then we can always provide an overview, or Miss Perez, that was also photographed. She's an additional resource. If you have any general overview questions, you can do that. Another great avenue is your teachers. Like I mentioned before, if a teacher's reaching out to you, they're also asking for additional support and assistance, and parents also to loop you in, to let you know, hey, this is what happened in my class. This is what I worked with alongside your student. So you can ask them about specific plans for your student, but you can always reach out to myself, and we can provide answers to your questions.
Hey, Camel, can I add to that?
Yeah.
I had a parent the other day reach out about something that happened in the classroom, and we were able to schedule a very quick meeting online through Google Meets. And so I say that's one of the benefits of COVID is that teachers are much more accessible to parents now because we can literally hop onto a Google Meet and take care of these issues very quickly. And so that has made me much more accessible to the parents in my classroom as well.
Mm-hmm. And then I was just going to say, for those parents, if you go to the website and you go under the counseling home, if you click on counseling blog, you can see the Wellness Center resources that we already currently do have there. And it talks a lot about mental health and the impact of, visual relaxation and sound and music and stretching and deep breathing and, what we can do to address students when they are feeling anxious and nervous. So absolutely feel free to explore there, and you can also reach out to your counselor.
So I don't see any other questions coming in tonight, so I think we'll wrap it up. I want to thank all the viewers who tuned in online tonight. I hope you all have a great Thanksgiving break. We hope this was informative, and hope you're excited about some of the restorative practices that we're putting into place as we go forward. I also want to thank our teacher panel, so Mary Lindsay, Heather Sharp, Lauren Savage, and Shelby Schofield, our brand new restorative practices specialist that we're so happy to have on board, Jabari Carr, and Camel Panu, Vice Principal over Discipline. So I want to thank everyone for their input tonight, and thank you again for tuning in. And it's not the last you'll hear about restorative practices, so we look forward to talking about it more in the future as well. So I want to wish everyone a great evening and a great Thanksgiving